So 1 Peter chapter 5, starting to read at verse 5. Young men, in the same way, be submissive to those who are older. All of you clothe yourselves with humility towards one another, because God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that he may lift you up in due time. Cast all your anxiety on him, because he cares for you. Quite a short passage today, and yet it is so full of good things for us to dig into and to find. As Peter began this next section, he actually begins with, as it has in the NIV, or certainly in the older versions of the NIV, young men in the same way. The newer versions have quite correctly turned that around, in the same way, young men. And that's because that's how he starts, and it's a connector. He's used that 3 times now, in the same way. 3 times in this letter he's used it. And so that causes us, when he's using a particular phrase in English, actually it's just one single word that he's used. It might be translated likewise, or similarly, in the same way. And whenever we see he's used it in the past, he's actually been changing from speaking from one people group to another. And this is no exception. Last week, if you were here, and if not, just quickly glance up the page, you'll see that he was speaking to the elders of the church leaders. And now he's turned from speaking to the church leaders to starting to talk to the younger element of the church. Last week we looked and we said that the church leaders are referred to in 3 different terms throughout the New Testament. There are 3 basic terms that come up. And it just so happens that this is one of only 2 places in Scripture, the other being in Acts chapter 20. This is one of 2 places where all 3 of these terms are used together. We had the word elders. And we saw that word is a word that simply means older people. Older people. And there are some churches that have taken that word and they've used it to describe their church. And we said that some of you have come from the Presbyterian church, and presbyteros is the word there for the elders. They were the spiritually mature of the church. Many of them would probably have been mature in age too. That seems to come quite naturally, that spiritual maturity takes time. And so they would have been of an older generation. And so we said the word elder can refer to older people, but here it's particularly applied to the spiritually mature men of the church. We also saw, of course, that he speaks about shepherds, and he told them to be shepherds of God's people, describing the work that they do in a very pictorial form. The work of the shepherd was a lowly task. It was hard work. But he uses that word shepherd, and we said that although shepherd, when it's written in the original language here, doesn't mean very much to us, when we see it in Latin, then we start to understand it because it's the word pastor. And so pastor and shepherd are exactly the same. And finally, we see that he tells them to be overseers, to oversee the work that they're doing, the people that are under their care. And by using that word overseer, he tells them that, in verse 2, be shepherds of God's flock that is under your care, serving as overseers. And this word is the word from which we get episcopal. And there is the Episcopal Church. We don't have an Episcopal Church here in the UK very much. We normally refer to it as the Anglican Church or the Church of England. But around the world, in other parts, it's sometimes called the Episcopal Church. And we can see that Episcopal has been translated into overseer and traditionally in the past as bishop. And there's a word that we're more familiar with. And so the Episcopal Church is overseen by a group of people that they call bishops. And so that's their church structure. But he's saying to these spiritually mature elders of the church that you have to be shepherds. You have to be, and I love the contrast here. We didn't bring this out particularly last week, so let me just do this for you now in verse 2, because he uses the word serving and then he connects it to the word overseer. Doesn't that seem a bit of an irony? I want you to be servants ruling over the church. Can you see how that doesn't quite fit, does it? And I think that Peter used those terms very deliberately, telling them to be humble people, serving as overseers, not lording it over others. Not ruling as such by command, but being an example to the flock. He says you don't ask the people that you're looking after, you don't ask them to do anything that you're not willing to do yourself. So he says that's how we rule in the church. It's a very humble experience. Now I've told you all of that because as we come into the next section, he starts with this phrase, in the same way, likewise, similarly. And we need to understand what the similarity is, what the likeness is between what we were looking at last week and what he's now telling the younger generation in the church. What is the similarity? And I think it is not about method. He's not saying, I want you to do the same as the elders of the church, although of course obviously if the elders are giving an example, then the idea is that if it's a good example that we're supposed to follow good examples. So Paul is able to say, follow my example as I follow the example of Christ. But that's because Paul's example was a good one. And Paul says, I'm following Christ, therefore if you follow me, you're not going to go wrong. Some of us might be a little bit wary of saying to other people, follow my example. Some of us may not be wary of saying it, but perhaps you ought to be. Let's examine ourselves deeply and say, am I really following the example of Christ truly? With all of my heart. Because if we can do that, then we can be a good example to others. And we need to be a good example at home. Those of you that are parents, let me just say to you, parents, be a good example to your children. Children will pick up so much of what they see going on in the home, copying parents. A lot of the actions that we see in children is not about genetics. It's actually more about what they've learnt. So be a good example. Parents, grandparents, same applies. We need to be a good example where we live to our neighbours, so that we are actually setting an example in the neighbourhood around us too. We don't want people pointing at you saying, those people, that person goes down to the local Baptist church down the road on a Sunday, and then on a Monday morning is out here shouting, screaming and swearing and whatever. That's not a great example, is it? Or is always moaning. That's not a great example. Or never shows any generosity, is always unkind. All these sorts of things. But instead of a negative, we want to be a positive. And so we want to be able to look at a situation and say, how can I actually do something positive for Christ in that situation. That applies in our neighbourhood, in the workplace, wherever it is we happen to find ourselves, on the bus, in the shop, being the example of Christ wherever we are. Very important. But as far as Peter is concerned, talking to the young men of the church, he's not saying that. He's not saying, in this particular instance, I want you to follow the example of these elders, though he does want them to do that. He's saying, I want you to have a similar attitude. And I think this is all about attitude. Attitude. And every time, and when I went back to the other two occasions where Peter has used that word in the same way, likewise, similarly, and moves on to a new people group, he's not saying, I want you to act in the same way. He's saying, I want you to act in the spirit of the same way, in the same attitude, to do the same kind of thing, to apply the principles, in other words. That's how I want you to be. And so Peter is saying here to these young men, and indeed I think we can apply this quite legitimately to ourselves today. He's saying it's all about attitude. I want you to have the same attitude. So let's have a look, shall we, at the attitude. What is that attitude? And we want, and the whole title today is about adopting the right attitude, or a right attitude. So let's think a little bit about the attitude, first of all. I was reminded of Philippians, Paul writing to the Philippian church, a very well-known passage. Let me just read to you from chapter 2. Your attitude should be the same as that of Christ Jesus, who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on a cross. He goes on to say, therefore God exalted him to the highest place, but let's hold it just there for the moment. So your attitude should be the same as that of Christ. Christ, who in all his glory and splendor and magnificence was prepared to give it up, to come down to this earth, to live as a human being. Now, you might kind of think, living as a human, well, that can't be that bad, surely. I mean, he could have been asked to live as something much lower than a human being, but he came as a human being. And a human being is the pinnacle of God's creation. And yet that is seen as humbling to God because he is so far above mankind. But not just to live in flesh. That itself was humbling. Why was that humbling? It was restrictive for a start. When you're in a body, there are certain things that your body can't do. You may have noticed that. You may have noticed that there are certain things that you used to do that your body now says no to. That's often a way, isn't it? I've just noticed in the last week or so, I pulled a muscle in my back, and my back is telling me there are certain things that you're not doing this week that you were doing last week. And most of the time it's okay, and then I move awkwardly, and it reminds me that I've pulled something there. But that's a restriction of the human body. And so, although there are things that I might want to do, I can't do. And there are things that all of us are the same. I was watching something on TV a little while ago, and to be honest, I haven't got a clue what I was watching. I was channel hopping, as you do, and as I saw this very active show going on, and it seems that they had like an obstacle course that these athletes were negotiating jumping over things and scaling great heights and goodness knows what else. And I thought to myself, as I looked at them, these guys are superhuman. I mean, how is it they can scale a vertical wall about the height of our ceiling here? I mean, how do they do it? I mean, how do they kind of jump such great lengths to get across from one side of the water to the other? How is it that they're able to swing from sort of one bar to another bar, great distances? You know, all of these things that were going on, and I thought to myself, that is almost superhuman. Now, they've trained really, really hard to do that. And no doubt that they will be among a very few elite group of people who could possibly do something like that. Although it does, of course, tell you and show us that the human body is capable of many great things. But for God to come down as a man, no matter how great man can be, no matter the great things he can achieve, it was still a humbling experience. But he takes that humility further because the Son of Man came to serve, not to be served. He came to minister. He came to be the servant. He came to serve, firstly, his heavenly Father, but in doing so, to minister, to serve us. How far did he take that? He was obedient to the call. He said that whatever he does is always because he's heard it from the Father, and he did nothing without hearing from the Father. So what did the Father ask him to do? Well, the Father asked him to come and to be baptized. John the Baptist objected, you may remember. But you're the Messiah. I can't baptize you. I need to be baptized by you, John protested. But Jesus would have none of it. No, he said, I too have to be baptized. That's part of what the Father had commanded him. He goes on into ministry. He has his 40 days in the desert. We've just been talking about Lent. What is Lent? Remembering the 40 days that Jesus spent in the wilderness. Fasting, praying. He came from that and he picks his disciples. And he takes this group and a rabble, you might say. And he brings them and knocks them into shape. Brings them to a point where they're going to lead the church themselves. What a humbling experience. Surely God, if he's got to come down to this earth and he's got to do all that the Father says, surely the Father could at least have given him some half-decent, intelligent, capable men. Not with the greatest respect, a bunch of half-wits. But that seems to have been what he got. But of course it all culminated, didn't it, in the cross. He became obedient to death, even death on a cross, Philippians puts it as. Even death on a cross. Not just any old death, but the worst form of execution that was around at the time. That's the kind of death that he went for. The death of a criminal. Not just any old criminal, but a really bad criminal. A lowlife. That's humility. To be hung up on the cross at the side of the road for everyone to come along and gape at. All the mocking that went before it. That was humiliation. But Jesus humbled himself. So Paul says, follow my example as I follow the example of Christ. Christ was completely obedient. Therefore, we also must be completely obedient. Romans chapter 12, just reading verse 2, do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. Don't conform to the pattern of this world, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. The mind plays a very big part in who we are as Christians. Our discipleship, the process, we are supposed to apply the mind. So when Paul says elsewhere, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, he's not saying, I want you to go and try and be saved by works, by doing something, but he's saying that you work it out by applying the mind and by putting what you've learnt and what you've applied and your understanding of God's word into practice in your life. Work it out that way. The mind is so important. And that's really what Peter is saying to us. It's the mind, it's an attitude. And an attitude comes from the kind of mind that we have, not intellectualism, but an attitude of mind, a state of mind, our demeanor, how we choose to be towards others, as well as, of course, towards God. The attitude is what makes all the difference. In the church, there were these elders. As I've said before, many of them probably were indeed older people, as well as being spiritually mature. It's worth perhaps just noting that the two don't necessarily go hand in hand. You can be an older person, which obviously doesn't mean that you are spiritually mature. There are older people who've come to faith later in life who are not going to be spiritually mature. There are older people who came to faith earlier in life but have never really developed and grown in their spiritual maturity. So it doesn't necessarily follow that an older person, even an older Christian who's been in the faith a long time, is necessarily spiritually mature. And equally, you can find at the other end of the scale that you get younger men who have grown very quickly in the faith and have matured. Timothy would be a great example. Titus would be another great example that Paul picks out of as men who were young and yet spiritually mature. So much so that he was happy to leave them in charge of some of the churches as elders, as overseers, as shepherds in the churches that Paul was establishing. Now, Paul kept a close watch on things, and he didn't give them carte blanche to do whatever they wanted to do, but instead he was there kind of guiding them and watching them from a distance still. It's also probably true to say that in the early church, that although you have individuals who are these pastors, overseers, and elders of the church, it's probably true to say that the church worked more on a plurality of leaders. And as you look at other examples of where the Bible teaches on the leadership of the church, it seems to speak in plurality. So the church, the early church, probably didn't know what it was to have one single elder looking after a church. It would have been worked out together, this plurality. And that's a really good thing to do, because any one of us, any single individual, can get misled. We are doing a very, very tricky thing in trying to discern and to understand the will of God, trying to interpret the scriptures and to apply them to our lives. And therefore it's good to have others that we can work with, others who also have understanding, who are prepared to commit themselves to studying the word and to say, what does it say? What does it mean? How do we interpret this correctly? And it's the old thing again from the Bible, isn't it? Iron sharpens iron. and that's a really good thing to do. So I think in the early church that they would have had lots of elders working together, and they would have, it's quite possible that they, because they met in houses, they didn't meet in church buildings like we do today. So it's quite possible that you'd have had, one elder who went and he looked particularly after that house group, if you like, and another one in another house group. But even within the house groups that they had, it's quite possible that there was more than one elder in some of them, depending on who you had there and the maturity of them. But these elders would have come together quite frequently to talk about, what next. That was the pattern right from the earliest time. The apostles used to meet together and they gave themselves to prayer and study of the word, it says. And you remember that's what's prompted them to elect some men filled with the Spirit to deal with the practicalities of running church life. They said, we shouldn't be serving on the tables. We've got other things we need to do. Let's give that responsibility to somebody else, while we commit to study of the word and to prayer. And elders, overseers of the church and pastors of the church, we need to spend an awful lot of time studying the word, getting to the real heart of what it says, and also to prayer, because nothing is going to happen without an awful lot of prayer. Many years ago, some of you will remember, and it's a long time ago, that we had a church growth day here, and we invited John Balchin, who came to us. And John, he was at Above Bar Church in Southampton. He just retired, and before that, Purley Baptist Church. He's been around these parts, and Morden Baptist Church before that, in fact. And so John came, and he's got a wealth of experience. He was a lecturer at what was then London Bible College 2 for some while. And he came in with all his experience that he had, and I shall never forget when he came in, and he had a good look around the church, and he came in and picked up his cup of coffee, and he sat down, and he said to me, he said, there are two things that bring about the greatest change and transformation in the church. And I was waiting for what these profound two things are. He said, number one is prayer, and number two is coffee. I'm pleased to say that I had perfected the art of one, but probably not the other. I'm not telling you which way around it was. You may have guessed. But I thought that it was a timely reminder that actually if we want the church to grow, it's not about how much human effort we put into it. It's actually about being spiritually mature people. And whilst John says tongue-in-cheek, prayer and coffee, there is something to be said for that, because actually by meeting together as church leaders come together over the cup of coffee, that's often where the real business takes place. That's where we discuss the finer points. That's where we debate the issues. And so it's good to be able to do that, but then to do it through prayer as well. Well, I think we better start focusing on these young men. Find out, who are they? What's their issue? Why is he writing specifically to them? And there's another question that came up into my mind as I was thinking about today, and that is, bearing in mind, as you well know, because you've been going through this with me for many, many months now, that Peter is writing to exiles. They were living in Rome. They were part of the church at Rome as the persecution of Nero broke out. So they've escaped the persecution and they've run off into modern-day Turkey. And as he writes to these people, the question in my mind is this: Peter, you've turned to speak specifically to the young men. Did you have some special piece of knowledge? Was there something you'd heard that alarmed you about the way the young men were acting, that caused you to address them? The problem with that is that Peter is writing to a group of believers who are spread out actually over a very wide area. Notice that as he begins the letter, chapter 1, verse 1, he writes to God's elect strangers in the world, scattered not together, but scattered throughout Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. It was a wide area. So either there is absolute, complete anarchy has just broken out in the church amongst the young men of the church, and Peter needs to address it, and therefore this special piece of information has come to him and he is addressing it. But I don't think it's that. And I don't think it's that for two reasons. Because one, that would be a big issue. Peter wouldn't have left it to the end. Number two, I don't think Peter would have given it 2 lines. I think he would have gone into more depth on it. And probably would have given some advice on how to quell the anarchy and give some advice on how to bring things under control for the future. I think he's speaking in more general terms. And so I'm prepared to accept that he is now talking generally. He knows what the state of young men are like. You see, the church was run by men, and I know that there are differences of opinion today on that, but in his day, the church was run by a body of men. It was very much a male-dominated situation. So if the leaders, the older men, the presbyteros, are running the church, who's going to take it on in the future? Well, that's the young men, isn't it? As the older men get too old to do what they need to do, or they're dying off, they need to be replaced by younger men. And the problem is with younger men is that they can get a bit impatient. Sometimes they think they're ready before their time. Now, as one who has had the interesting experience of starting church leadership at a very young age, I kind of have some understanding and sympathy with what Peter is writing, because I kind of look at myself now and I look back and think to myself, if I was to meet myself when I was 18 years of age, would I have confidence? Would I have confidence to put me into church leadership? My honest conclusion is, what a frightful thought. When I look back at some of the incredible naivety, mistakes, and all sorts of things that I made as a much younger Christian and leader, I kind of think to myself, maybe my advice today would have been, no, wait. Definitely wait. Don't go into it yet. I'm also conscious that in 20 years' time, I may look back and say, the Keith that I knew in his 40s, I wouldn't have touched him with a barge pole either. So, I'm not perfect. I'm still a work in progress. But I think it's really important for us to understand that these young men were champing at the bit, as we say. They were eager to get in there because they thought they could do a better job, probably, or at least an equal job, to the elders in the church. There does seem to be an effect with people as they get older, is that they kind of mellow a little bit. They're not quite so outgoing, maybe is the right word. For us guys, we understand as we go through life that it's a lot of it, I think, is physiological. It's to do with hormones. I think as we're younger and the testosterone is higher, we tend to be sort of more aggressive and go-getters, more competitive. And that can be a good thing, but sometimes that needs to be harnessed in as well. And as we get a little older and we say we calm down, we mellow a little bit, we become more perhaps rational people. And that's also a good thing, because that can be a calming experience and influence upon the church. But what do the young men do? They kind of look and say, what are you doing? You older folk, we need to be getting out there and doing something. I think of myself as a teenager. And in those days in my home church at Chiddingfold, and we had a wonderful pastor who would have quite rightly been a presbyteros. He was an older man. He was pretty much sort of retired or semi-retired when I knew him in those teen years. But he was a wonderful, godly man, a very calm, mellow sort of character to him. I don't think I ever once saw him get uptight about anything. He just took everything in his stride. And looking back now, I think that I must have been his worst nightmare. I really do. And not that I was doing anything particularly bad, quite the opposite. I was very passionate about getting on and doing stuff. And I kind of used to turn up to the church and question, why aren't we doing this? Why aren't we doing that? We should be doing something else as the church. We ought to be pushing forward. We need to be, why are we being so kind of laid back about everything? And he would, kind of listen to my comments. And I remember once at a church meeting, he described me as his unofficial deacon. Which kind of tells you, I think, of the kind of person I was, kind of interfering with everything, but just stirring things up. But I think that was the kind of the passion that was running deep inside me at the time. I think Peter knew that the young men of the church were similar. They were full of the passion. They were full of energy. And they were kind of getting frustrated with the older men of the church, feeling, come on, make way for us. It's our turn now. Hand things over to us. And he says, no, not yet. In fact, he says, if you humble yourself, God will raise you up in time. At the right time. Not a specific time, but in his time. He will exalt you. So what does he say? Young men, be submissive to those who are older. And that word submissive is connected to, not as in the words are similar words, but the idea is connected to that of humility. And you'll notice that there's been a lot of talk here about submission and humility in these verses. They come hand in hand. He says, you have to just listen to these elders. Just go with them. And then at the right time, then you'll be invited to come and join them and to have your input. Humble yourselves. But notice that he says this, staying in verse 5, all of you. Does he mean all of you young men? Although, because he's just mentioned the older folk as well, is he talking about young and old alike? I tend to think he means young and old alike. All of you. All of you, he says, clothe yourselves with humility towards one another. He's saying, you elders of the church, you older folk in the church, you be humble towards the younger ones who are itching to get on with things and have got so much energy. And you younger ones, you show humility and respect also towards the older ones. They're where they are in their positions as overseers with good reason. Respect their judgments and their opinions. Don't try to overthrow them. I love this phrase here, clothe yourselves. I think, as so often happens in translation, the full force and meaning of words doesn't come through. And I was fascinated looking into the background behind this, because he's saying here basically this, and let me kind of put it into a modern context. Put your work clothes on. That's literally it. It means here to tie on an apron. The servant would wear an apron and it would be tied to him, and it would be a sign of his status as the servant in the house. He's not the lord of the manor. He's not some kind of great person. He's the servant. And he says here, bind on your aprons. Clothe yourselves with humility. And the apron, the work clothes, were the symbol of the humility. He says, you are servants in the church. And therefore, he says, you young men, if you want to take charge, if you want to lead, if you want to be overseers, you first of all have to be submissive. You have to serve too. You have to be humble. Very important. Then he quotes from Proverbs 3, verse 34, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. God opposes the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. Be patient, he says. Young men aren't good at being patient. But there's something else that struck me, because in verse 6, he tells them to humble yourselves under God's mighty hand, that he may lift you up in due time. Humble yourselves under God's mighty hand. What an interesting phrase, I thought. He doesn't say humble yourselves under the authority of the elders of the church, but under God's mighty hand. You see, the elders of the church are under God's mighty hand, and God's mighty hand is another way of talking about God's almighty power, God's powerful hand, the fact that nobody can stand against him. And don't forget that the church is in a time of great stress and distress. It's a time of persecution. It's a time when people are losing their lives and their freedom for the gospel. It's a time when they're being persecuted in the streets. It's a time when some of them are having the hardest days of their lives. This is not something to be flippant about. It's not something to be careless about. Peter says we must treat everything with caution. We have to remember that people's lives are at stake here. The church must act wisely. Therefore, everything is under God's control. Do you believe that? Do you believe that your circumstances are under God's control today? Do you believe that he actually has everything in hand? Do you believe that there is nothing that is outside of his power and his capability? Because it must have been tempting for people to think that in those days, to think, actually, God, maybe he doesn't know what he's doing. Maybe he's forgotten us, but he's saying, no matter what you go through, whether it's good or bad, God is still in control. His mighty hand is still over the whole thing. And if you do a study of God's hand throughout Scripture, it's fascinating how God has used his mighty hand in battle in favor of the Israelites. How God has done so many things using his mighty hand. I challenge you, go through and look at it and see how God's mighty hand or God's right hand has been used. And he's saying here that God's mighty hand, his right hand, is still in control. You have nothing to fear. So therefore, if what you're going through at the moment is God's will, if the struggles you have are to God's knowledge and his intention, humble yourself beneath God's will or God's mighty hand. Don't try and stretch beyond it. Don't try and push his hand away. That would be to set yourself up against God. But instead, with wisdom, you endure. That leads us on to verse 7. This has been quoted so many times, usually out of context, but quoted so many times. Cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you. Cast all your anxiety. Anxiety comes from the word divided. And you might think, how on earth did we get from divided to anxiety? Well, it's like this. that when you're anxious about something, your mind is elsewhere. Have you noticed that? Have you ever been in those conversations with somebody where you've suddenly realized that either you or they, depending on who's the anxious one, who's got something on their mind, is miles away. And you can kind of see that they're physically there, but they're not concentrating, they're not listening because their attention is somewhere else. It's divided. And that's what he's saying is happening here to these people. He's saying that some of you have got your minds elsewhere. You're not focused where you should be, which is on what God is doing, but instead your mind is somewhere else because you are concerned about other things. Now you can take that into the context out of its original context into situations where people today have all sorts of worries. Some of them very serious worries, and some of them, frankly, quite trivial. And people just say, and have said for many years, cast all your cares or your anxieties on him, for he cares for you. I think Peter is talking about something very serious here. He's not talking about little troubles. I think his word, which has been translated anxieties here, gives a depth of the trouble. It's not just a mere distraction. It's something that has cut you completely off from where you should be. It's diverted you. He says, get away from that, your diversions that are taking you away from God's will, and get back into God's plan, under his mighty hand, under his will again. Follow the plan, he's saying. Because that's the way to success. Remember, it says, he cares for you. He's saying that God has not forgotten you, that your anxiety, the fact you are anxious to do something else because you think it's for God, and yet you've stepped outside of his will, although that's not genuine, if you get back into his will, even though you might think it's a hardship, you will realize very quickly that actually you're back into God's care. Remember that he is the shepherd, the chief shepherd. The shepherd cares for the sheep. And he's saying to this younger generation, God is still your shepherd. He is still guiding you. He is taking you through the barren places, through the drought, as well as through the storms, and then to the still waters, and to the pasture, and to a place where you can lie down in safety. That is our mighty God. I want to encourage you today that, young or old alike, that sometimes we have anxiety, sometimes we have our own cares, sometimes we think that we can do something for God, but be careful that we're not stepping outside of his will. I think we need to be discerning and asking ourselves, where is God leading us? What is he doing? And to say that I will come into that. That's where God is leading. That's what we've discerned. We must follow that and stick with the plan. And in that way, we will see God's blessing poured out upon us, poured out upon you in your individual lives as you do that too, as well as a church. Let's pray.